In the 1700s, a trapper was bound and blindfolded and forced to walk for 2 days through the forests and hills of Alabama. His journey ended deep inside a cave. When his blindfold was removed, he saw mountains of Spanish treasure. His captors presented him with a question. Answering the question correctly would lead to riches beyond his wildest dreams. Answering incorrectly would lead to deceit and murder. This is the story of Redbone Cave. In 1539, a Spanish explorer named Hernando de Soto arrived in present-day Florida near Tampa. Over the next few years, he and his men traveled to the north exploring, which consisted of murdering native men, taking native women for his men, taking any valuables that they could get their hands on, and enslaving young boys and young men. Over the next 2 years, he traveled across the American South, pillaging and plundering until he finally met his end in either Arkansas or Mississippi due to fever. Over these 2 years, De Soto stole anything he could from all of the Native American tribes in the region. And in 1541, he had a famous run-in with the Chickasaw tribe. De Soto demanded that the chief of the Chickasaw tribe provide his men with hundreds of native women. The chief, knowing that this was going to cause a conflict, refused De Soto's demand. The chief of the Chickasaw, knowing that De Soto was most likely gathering his men for an attack, decided to preemptively attack De Soto in the middle of the night. This attack was hugely successful. Many of De Soto's men were killed, and the ones that were left had to flee. And they had to flee in a hurry. They had to leave behind all of this wealth that they had gathered over the last few years. There were tons of gold, silver, and jewels that they had accumulated that they had to leave behind. And this story was passed down for the next 180 years until 1720, when a white trapper showed up asking to trap on their land. This man was very pleasant, very respectful to the Chickasaw, and the chief granted him permission. The chief's daughter had been watching the interaction between the chief and this trapper very intently. When the encounter between the chief and the trapper was finished and the trapper left, the daughter went to the chief and told him that this is the man. This is the man that I want to marry. This chief only had a daughter, and he had been bringing tribesmen to her, trying to get her to marry one so he could have a grandson that could later take over. But every single man that the chief had chosen, the daughter had refused until this trapper showed up in their land. So the chief provided quarters to the trapper. This was very unusual, but the trapper was very grateful and just went about his business, completely unaware that both the chief and the daughter were watching him intently. After about a month, the trapper was asleep when 2 men entered his tent. He was still asleep, he was kind of waking up, he was still groggy, but he felt his hands being bound, and he started to fight back. But it was too late. His hands were already bound, and there were 2 of them, and he couldn't really fight his way out, so he just had to give in. The 2 men blindfolded the trapper and also reassured him that he was going to be okay, they meant no harm. The trapper was obviously very suspicious of this, but he was bound, he was blindfolded, there wasn't much he was going to do otherwise. The trapper decided just to go with them and bide his time until he could figure out a way to escape. These 2 men marched the trapper through the woods for the remainder of that night and the entire next day. They walked miles and miles away from their camp. The trapper had no idea what was going on, so he was very on edge, he was very alert, and taking note of his surroundings. He would take note of the sounds around him and the air changes. Every once in a while, his blindfold would slip down and he would get a glimpse of his surroundings. As they were traveling towards the end of their journey, there was one time where he could hear water rushing. He knew that he was by a river. His blindfold slipped and he saw white bluffs. One of the 2 men immediately grabbed the blindfold, pulled it back up, reset it, and he could no longer see. But what he had seen, he recognized. Soon after this, all 3 men entered a canoe, crossed the river, traveled up a bank on the other side of the river, and then started traveling and climbing down. When they reached the bottom of this downward climb, the ground was mostly sand and gravel, and the air had become wet and cool. At this point, the trapper knew that he was inside a large cave. They proceeded to navigate through the cave. The 2 men would hold his head down so he didn't hit his head on overhanging rocks. They would crawl through small passageways, and they finally reached their destination and stopped. stopped. When they took off his blindfold, he saw the chief and the Chickasaw medicine man standing in front of him. As he was looking around and his eyes were beginning to adjust, he noticed that there was also gold, silver, and jewelry stacked from the floor all the way to the ceiling of this room they were in. The trapper couldn't believe this. The Chickasaw had been so kind to him, and then all of a sudden blindfolded him, bound his wrists, and took him to this cave where they're now showing him gold and silver. The chief was very straightforward with him. He said, "Marry my daughter and all of this could be yours." The trapper thought about this and then said, "What happens if I don't marry your daughter?" The chief told him that he would be very disappointed, but that was okay. That's why they blindfolded him, so he wouldn't know the location of this treasure. So if the trapper didn't want to marry his daughter, then they would simply blindfold him, take him back to the camp, and release him. The trapper thought that this made sense and was probably true, but at the same time, he was still bound and had been blindfolded, so he was still very suspicious. The trapper decided that he needed to bide his time and not commit to anything. So he simply told the chief that his daughter was a lovely woman, but this was a very big decision in his life and he couldn't make it on the spot. He needed time to think about this. So the chief agreed, blindfolded the trapper, and they began their journey back to the camp. As they got closer and closer to the camp, the trapper knew that if the plan was to either marry the daughter or be killed, that when they got to the camp, there was no way he was going to escape. So just a few miles from the camp, when the chief was getting tired and it was getting late, they decided to rest, and the trapper took this opportunity to make his escape. In order to make sure that he was able to escape and no one would be coming after him, he had to kill both the chief and the medicine man. After the trapper murdered both the chief and the medicine man, he traveled to Fort Rosalie, where he met up with one of his old friends and told him his entire story. His friend was obviously very eager to get out there and find this treasure, so that's what they did. They gathered up all of their stuff and they went searching for this lost treasure. They went out to the Tennessee River where this trapper believed that this cave was holding this treasure, and they searched and searched, and over the next few months they didn't find anything. The trapper's friend began to believe that this treasure wasn't there, or that the trapper had no idea where it was. The trapper's friend became disgruntled and he ended up leaving. The trapper didn't want to just let this treasure go, so he took his chances and headed back to the Chickasaw camp. None of the Chickasaw knew that the chief and the medicine man had taken him to go find this treasure. They didn't know anything about it. They had passed down this story of this lost treasure, but nobody knew if it was even really true, let alone where the treasure actually was. So no one blamed this trapper, who they knew and was their friend, for the disappearance of the chief and the medicine man. So the trapper married the chief's daughter and he stayed with them. Over the coming years, he would go off on these trapping trips from their camp. What he was really doing was going out and searching for this treasure. But in 1729, his wife, the daughter of the chief, died and he had no reason to stay there. The trapper ended up heading back to Fort Rosalie and spent the rest of his life telling the story of the lost treasure at Red Bone Cave. This cave is supposed to be located near Muscle Shoals in Alabama along the Tennessee River. Many people also believe that Lake Pickwick now covers the entrance to the cave, and if that's the case, then it's going to be very difficult for any ordinary treasure hunters to go find it. I hope you enjoyed the story. If so, there's another one right here. Don't forget to like, leave comments, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.